Picture this. It's February 2008. A presidential primary is unfolding in real time, and one of the most dramatic religious leadership transitions in modern American history is about to collide head-on with it. At Trinity United Church of Christ on Chicago's South Side, a 36-year era is ending. The Reverend Jeremiah Wright Jr., the man who built this congregation from a struggling handful of members into one of the largest, most influential Black churches in the country, is stepping down. And waiting to take his place is a younger pastor he handpicked himself, the Reverend Otis Moss III. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a story about succession, about legacy, about one generation passing the torch to the next inside the walls of a single Chicago congregation. But these were not normal circumstances, because sitting in the pews of that very church for 2 decades had been a member named Barack Obama, and within weeks, this quiet church transition would become one of the most scrutinized religious stories in American political history. Let's set the stage properly, because to understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what Trinity United actually was before any of this became national news. Founded in 1961, Trinity United Church of Christ grew, under Jeremiah Wright's leadership starting in 1972, into a congregation with thousands of members. A church deeply rooted in the Black liberation theology tradition and known for its Afrocentric, socially engaged approach to ministry. Wright didn't just preach on Sundays. He built a church that ran food pantries, addiction recovery programs, HIV and AIDS ministries, prison outreach, and one of the most robust community development operations on Chicago's South Side. By the time the 2000s rolled around, Trinity wasn't just a church. It was an institution, and Wright himself had become one of the most respected and most theologically provocative Black pastors in the country. This is the church a young community organizer named Barack Obama walked into in the late 1980s, looking for a spiritual home in Chicago. And it's the church where he was eventually baptized, where he was married, and where his 2 daughters were baptized as well. So fast forward to February 2008. Wright delivers his final sermon as senior pastor, closing out those 36 years and stepping into the role of pastor emeritus. In March, on Palm Sunday, Otis Moss III officially becomes senior pastor. And in June of that year, Moss preaches his first sermon in that formally installed role. On paper, this is simply a well-planned, carefully orchestrated succession, the kind that healthy institutions try to pull off for years in advance. Wright had reportedly been grooming Moss for this exact moment. This wasn't a sudden departure or a forced resignation. It was, by every account available at the time, a deliberate handoff between a pastor entering retirement and a chosen successor stepping into a role he'd been preparing for. But the timing could not have been worse, or depending on how you look at it, more explosive. Because this transition was happening at the exact moment that Trinity United, and Jeremiah Wright specifically, became the epicenter of the 2008 presidential race. Here's what happened. In the weeks surrounding this leadership change, video clips of Wright's past sermons began circulating on cable news and across the internet, and they spread like wildfire. The most infamous of these was a fiery, impassioned sermon in which Wright, invoking the language of Black liberation theology and drawing on centuries of America's treatment of Black citizens, declared that God should condemn a nation that had failed to live up to its own ideals of equality and justice. That clip, boiled down into a soundbite widely referred to as the Goddamn America sermon, exploded across every major news network. Stripped of its full theological and historical context, delivered in isolation to a national television audience that had never sat inside Trinity's sanctuary and never experienced the tradition Wright was preaching from, it became instant political ammunition. And because Obama was, at that exact moment, the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination. And because he had described Wright as a mentor and a spiritual father figure, the story wasn't really about a church anymore. It became a referendum on Obama himself, on his judgment, his associations, and by extension, his fitness for the presidency. The media firestorm that followed was relentless. Cable news ran the clips on a loop. Opposing campaigns seized on the controversy. Commentators debated for weeks whether Obama needed to disavow Wright entirely, whether their decades-long relationship was disqualifying, and whether the broader tradition of prophetic Black preaching that Wright represented was simply unfamiliar and, therefore, alarming to a national audience that had never had to reckon with it before. Obama himself, facing enormous pressure, delivered what would become one of the most significant speeches of his political career, a direct address on race in America, delivered in Philadelphia in March of 2008, in which he tried to explain both his relationship with Wright and the broader, complicated history of race, grievance, and faith in Black America. It was widely regarded as a pivotal moment in the campaign, a moment where Obama attempted to turn a crisis into a national conversation rather than let it define him as merely guilty by association. But here's the part of the story that often gets lost in the political retelling, because most of the coverage from that era focused almost entirely on Obama, on the campaign, on the horse race implications of the controversy. What actually happened inside Trinity United during this period? What happened to the church itself and to the two pastors caught in the middle of a story that was never really about them, but that consumed their lives anyway? Because remember, this was happening during the exact same window as the leadership transition. Wright wasn't simply retiring quietly into the background. He was, at the height of a presidential campaign, simultaneously the subject of an unprecedented national media assault and a pastor trying to hand off his life's work to a successor. And Moss, the incoming senior pastor, wasn't just inheriting a pulpit. He was inheriting a congregation under siege, a media spotlight none of them had asked for, and the responsibility of defending not just his mentor, but an entire theological and cultural tradition that was being publicly mischaracterized in front of a national audience. Wright, for his part, ultimately made the decision to take a sabbatical, stepping back from public engagements to remove himself from the immediate glare of the campaign spotlight. A decision that also had the effect of shielding Trinity's day-to-day life and Obama's campaign from further controversy tied directly to his continued public appearances. But that left a vacuum, and Moss stepped directly into it. As the newly installed senior pastor, still in the earliest months of his tenure, Moss found himself thrust into the position of publicly defending not just his predecessor's character, but the broader legitimacy of the African American church tradition itself. He pushed back forcefully against the framing that had dominated cable news, arguing that what was happening to Wright wasn't simply legitimate scrutiny of a controversial figure. It was, in his view, an attack on an entire prophetic preaching tradition that stretches back through the history of Black churches in America, a tradition of pastors speaking hard truths about injustice from the pulpit, a tradition that long predates Wright and that Moss himself had inherited and was now being asked to defend in real time, on a national stage, while barely months into the most important job of his career. Think about the position that put him in. Most new senior pastors get time. They get a runway to settle into the role. to build trust with a congregation that's still adjusting to a new voice in the pulpit, to make the job their own gradually, on their own terms. Moss got almost none of that. He got a congregation that was simultaneously mourning the departure of a legendary 36-year pastor, adjusting to new leadership, and under a level of hostile national media scrutiny that virtually no American congregation of any denomination had ever experienced before. And he had to hold all of that together, in public, while still trying to become, internally, the pastor his congregation actually needed him to be. Eventually, the pressure reached a breaking point that went beyond even what Wright's sabbatical could contain. In late May of 2008, Barack and Michelle Obama made the difficult decision to formally resign their membership at Trinity United altogether, ending a relationship with the church that had spanned roughly 2 decades. It was a decision reportedly made with real reluctance, and one that came only after months of the controversy showing no signs of fading. A recognition that as long as they remained formally tied to the congregation, every subsequent controversial remark from anyone associated with the church risked becoming, once again, a story about the campaign rather than a story about the church itself. For Trinity, and for Moss specifically, this added yet another layer of complexity. The church that had shaped a future president's spiritual life, that had been central to his personal story for 2 decades, was now formally cut loose from him in the middle of Moss's first months as senior pastor, with the entire situation still playing out under a national spotlight. And yet, despite all of that outside pressure, despite a level of scrutiny that could easily have fractured a congregation or derailed a new pastor's leadership before it even began, something different happened inside Trinity United. According to accounts from members who lived through this period, the crisis, paradoxically, helped cement Moss's role rather than undermine it. Rather than being seen as an unproven successor still living in his predecessor's shadow, Moss was seen navigating an unprecedented, genuinely unfair situation with composure and conviction, defending his church and his mentor publicly, while still tending to the pastoral needs of a congregation that needed stability more than ever. Members reportedly credited that tumultuous stretch, the very thing that could have destabilized the transition, with actually helping the church family accept him as their new leader. In a strange way, the fire that could have consumed the transition instead forged it. Moss didn't get the quiet, gradual runway most new pastors get. He got trial by national controversy. And by most accounts, he passed that test in a way that earned him credibility he might otherwise have taken years to build. It's worth stepping back and thinking about what this entire episode actually reveals, beyond the headlines from that particular election cycle. This wasn't just a story about one campaign controversy from 2008. It was a real-time collision between the private, internal life of an American religious institution and the unforgiving mechanics of a national political spotlight. One that neither Wright, nor Moss, nor the congregation itself had any real ability to control. It's a story about how quickly a decades-long tradition of theological and social justice preaching, one deeply rooted in the specific historical experience of Black churches in America, can be flattened into a 10-second soundbite when it's yanked out of context and broadcast to an audience that has never sat in those pews. And it's a story about leadership under genuinely extraordinary pressure, about a pastor stepping into the biggest job of his career at the exact moment his church became the most talked about congregation in the country, and somehow, according to those who were there, coming out the other side with the trust of his congregation intact. Trinity United Church of Christ continued on after 2008, well beyond the news cycle that made its name a household phrase for a few tumultuous months. Otis Moss III has remained senior pastor there for well over a decade since, building his own reputation as a preacher, author, and public voice in his own right. No longer simply Wright's handpicked successor, but a significant religious leader in his own tradition. Wright, for his part, stepped back from the national spotlight as the campaign moved on, remaining pastor emeritus of the church he'd built. And Barack Obama, of course, went on to win that election and become the 44th president of the United States, carrying with him, whether he wanted to or not, a formative religious and moral education shaped inside the sanctuary of a church that for one unforgettable season became one of the most talked about institutions in the country. What this episode ultimately shows is something worth remembering anytime a religious institution finds itself unexpectedly thrust into the center of political life. Leadership transitions are hard enough on their own, under normal circumstances, without a hostile national spotlight attached to them. Trinity United had to navigate one of the most difficult stretches in its history. Not because of anything internally wrong with the church, but because of the collision between its own private institutional life and the outside political world's demand for a story. And in the middle of that collision stood two pastors, one retiring, one just beginning, both forced to publicly defend not just themselves, but an entire tradition, at the exact moment they least expected to have to. That, more than any single soundbite from 2008, is the real story of what happened at Trinity United Church of Christ.